Hello Exiles, we are finally back with a Wintertide brand Trickster update. This iteration of the build is probably the strongest it's ever been, and my personal favorite version of the build. As with previous leagues, I was able to league start with this skill, as well as do all content in the game, including tier 17s and uber bosses. In this video, I will highlight some key progression points, as well as build features, including the changes that came with this league update. If you haven't heard of the skill before, I don't blame you, because honestly, it's very underrepresented in the player base. To bring you up to speed, and to give a short summary of how this build works, so basically we go low life Trickster, we don't use the Shavs, use a coruscating elixir to stop chaos damage from bypassing energy shield, and we use the Trader Keystone from a timeless jewel to sustain our flask charges permanently. In terms of the changes going into this league, so we don't use Hatred anymore because it no longer grants more cold damage. The auras Grace and Determination, they don't give us much flat defenses, obviously, to compensate. The average defense per gear is higher now. My only problem with this is that I feel like early on, when you're really just prioritizing things like life, just resistances, we feel a lot weaker early. But I will say that by endgame, the build's defenses were much higher than compared to previous leagues. In terms of build progression, your main goal is to transition to low life as soon as possible. I think with the removal of the Divine Blessing support skill gem, Eldritch Battery builds are significantly weaker, so the best way to play Wintertide brand nowadays is probably a low life or a CI version of it. Obviously early on, because we don't have the items to be low life, we still start as Mind Over Matter Eldritch Battery, but the build just does so much more damage and is noticeably more tanky once you switch to low life. Luckily, at this point in the league, most of the required items to transition to low life are very cheap, and in general, the market values of these items tend to fall very quickly after league start. One thing I will note in terms of progression changes this league is armor gearing. So Trickster by default doesn't have great access to armor because the class is naturally biased towards evasion, being on the right side of the tree. This is especially true this league because base armor and from Determination was decreased and the Defiance banner was removed. I will personally not use Determination until I have the Crown of the Inward Eye helmet as well as armor evasion boots equipped. We still want to use armor because physical mitigation is very hard to come by for Tricksters, and also because we want to use Molten Shell. When you are referencing the PoBs in the description, I recommend using the Target baseline PoB to start out and then progressively adding upgrades with reference to the min-maxed endgame version. The baseline build should be strong enough to take on most, if not all, endgame content, and my goal as a build creator is to avoid using any expensive chase items, especially if I'm advertising something as a league starter. If you run into any progression problems or if you have any specific questions, you can feel free to leave a comment down below. Now, if you're checking out the build for the first time and you're scrolling down through a PoB and suddenly you come across Autoexertion Warcry, you might be very confused. You're thinking, Autoexertion, exerted attacks, cold dot, what the heck is going on? We're using a 15% reservation for purely cosmetic purposes? Or what? The case usage comes actually from a medium cluster jewel for exerted attacks, which, as you can imagine, is also a cosmetic feature because we don't obviously use exerted attacks. But hold on, we're almost getting there. The cluster notable Lead by Example provides us with Onslaught for 4 seconds if we have Warcry recently. By auto-exerting General's Cry, which has a 3-second base cooldown, we are able to sustain permanent onslaught through maps and all boss encounters. For the second keystone on this cluster jewel, we are using Warning Call, which provides us with a significant armor increase. As a showcase, you can see that in this example, before using a Warcry, we have about 18,000 armor, and after Warcrying near an enemy, we jump all the way up to 28,000 armor. So the buff lasts for 8 seconds, and considering we Warcry at least every 3 seconds, the uptime on this armor increase is very good. You might be wondering why I'm using Inferno Cry over General's Cry in the final endgame version of the PoB. So, Grinding Gear Games changed it so that you do not get any buffs or charges from Warcries if you auto-exert them. However, enemies are still affected by any debuffs that are caused by the Warcries. Inferno Cry causes enemies affected by the Warcry to explode for fire damage, which helps for mapping. The only problem is that the base cooldown of this Warcry is 8 seconds. So I'm using the Ashes of the Star Amulet to reduce the cooldown below 4 seconds needed to sustain permanent onslaught. To start out, I always recommend using General's Cry because it's the only Warcry that has a below 4 second cooldown to start with. Now let's talk about cast speed. I think this is a very misunderstood topic when it comes to building a Wintertide brand character, so I'm going to give my fairly informed opinion on how much cast speed you actually need to include in your builds. So people are generally correct that Wintertide brand needs more cast speed. More the better, right? Because Wintertide brand deals 20% more damage per stage, and by default you cannot reach 20 stages. So if your build cannot hit at least 20 stages per brand duration, everything you do needs to go into cast speed immediately, because to every stage gives you 20% more damage. But how about beyond 20 stages? When do we stop investing in cast speed? What I personally found is that there are diminishing returns to cast speed, and that increasing the damage ceiling of your Wintertide brand is more important. So I'm not going to draw a graph this time, but the summary is that being able to reach max stages faster comes at the opportunity cost of actually increasing the damage ceiling when you do get to max stages. So my general rule is that we take cast speed where convenient, but we are not going to go out of our way to chase after it on the passive skill tree or on gear affixes. For example, on my endgame wand, I actually have 0 cast speed on it. To give an example of what I mean by convenient, I would highlight the 5 frenzy charges that this build has, as well as permanent onslaught. Between these two things, we have 40% increased cast speed, which goes a long way to improving our brand activation speed. But at the same time, we're also getting 20% more damage multiplier, 20% move speed, 40% attack speed. And so, we're not really wasting the resources when we're investing in this cast speed. Just a quick note on scaling skill effect duration. So we get some free duration from masteries, malevolence, but I don't personally like to scale duration, because while it helps for things like quality of life, cast speed actually increases how fast you do the damage, but skill effect duration just makes your brands last longer, which not necessarily is an increase to your damage. I want to highlight some gameplay tips when it comes to Wintertide brand. But full disclaimer, in most Path of Exile endgame encounters, our resources here are technically infinite, and they're endless as long as we don't die. So above all else, you should be focused on dodging and staying alive. However, I think it's helpful to at least understand the Wintertide brand's mechanics in order to maximize your DPS uptime. So Wintertide brand's damage comes in 2 parts. Number 1 is while the brand is attached. You can attach up to 3 bands, and they all do individual cold damage over time. Number 2 is the debuff Wintertide's End, which is only applied when a brand detaches or when it expires. So, as you can imagine, our goal here is to maximize the secondary debuff uptime. Let's look at some examples. Take this Uber Cortex fight, for example. Since conveniently 2 bosses are summoned, the brands detach and reattach to the 2 targets if they are close together, so we don't have to do anything else here, and our secondary debuff duration is very good. Now how about if there is a situation where there's only 1 target? In this case, it is recommended to use brand recall to force the secondary debuff to apply. What I mean by this is that while brands are attached, you cast brand recall on top of the boss to immediately detach and reattach the brands to apply the secondary debuff. Any brand stages built up are not lost when they are detached. When it comes to Uber bossing, there are usually 2 approaches. Your character is either has so much damage that it can instantly delete the boss, or your character is tanky enough to survive boss mechanics and slowly work through the HP. Wintertide brand clearly falls into the second category, so as mentioned earlier, maximizing your TPS is not as important as just staying alive. The only thing I would say to avoid doing is continually casting brands when 5 are already active, because you are preventing them from reaching max stages and maintaining max stages. If I had to objectively rate Wintertide brand, at the end of the day, I don't think it's the strongest skill in the game. And I would say that the playstyle is not for everyone. However, I personally enjoy the skill, and honestly that's really the only thing that matters. Although the build has gone through a lot of small changes league to league, it has continuously and consistently been able to do all content and all Ubers. So if you do decide to give this build a shot, let me know down below in the comments how it went, and I thank you very much for watching. Good luck, Exiles.